So welcome to this budget edition of Views from the Capitol. I'm Jennifer Smith, Director of Government Relations for the Michigan Association of School Boards. And with me is my team, Jeff Cobb and DeShandria Bedingfield. And also it's Bob Dwan from the Michigan School Business Officials. We're going to go through the last couple budgets that just passed. The supplemental budget 4421 was all federal money that was signed yesterday. And then the school aid budget 4411, which is on the governor's desk, and we're hearing she will sign early next week. So what we talk about today is going to be what passed and was enrolled with the governor. Understand that there may be vetoes coming, but we don't expect any of the big things to be vetoed. So a lot of the stuff we'll talk about today is going to be fine. I think where you may see some of the vetoes could be in some of the categoricals and line items, but we don't know that for sure yet. So that'll be coming out early next week. So just watch for updates from your association to let you know what was vetoed, how we are going forward. But as I said, the big things should be fine. So signed yesterday was the supplemental with the rest of the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 money that the feds wanted to distribute through the Title 1A formula. So all of that money should be beginning to flow to you soon. There was not an equity payment included in it. And this was a big thing that we had fought for with the first pot of money that went out and really wanted included with this pot of money. And when it was passed by the House, there was an equity payment to bring everyone to $1,093 per pupil. But as it moved through the system and the final version that was sent to the governor was just straight federal allocation of the title through the Title 1A formula. So districts were all over the board. Included in the school aid budget, there is a supplemental payment where we got the equalization payment put back in. So under the budget that should be signed early next week, you will receive your equalization payment if you receive less than $1,093 per pupil from the federal government under Title 1A. You will receive enough funding to bring you to that point when the next budget is signed, when 4420 or 4411 is signed. So we were able to get the equalization payment. It just took us a few more steps and a few more phone calls. Thank you to all of you who made those phone calls as well. We know that the public pressure also helped get that payment back in. So you will see that. It's just not in the budget that was signed yesterday. It will be in the big budget that will be signed next week. Anything else on the supplemental funding we should cover, Bob?
There was, a little bit of money. There was an additional $2.4 million that was added, and that was just based simply on the state receiving more funds. And so these are just more funds going into that ESSER 3 allocation for districts. So in comparison to the rest of the money, not a great deal of money, but at least it's moving in the right direction. School lunch 31D program, significant increase, $366 million. That was allocated out, all federal funds, removes any general funds, and that's almost, it ends up to be about $940 million in total for the school lunch program under 31D section. So that's a good thing. Also some adjustment, $94 million, and that's basically for special ed costs that are expected for the 2021 school year. So more or less some cleanup. I think Jen hit the bigger points of what we were looking for. And certainly that per pupil at 1,093 was something that we're very excited about seeing. So keeps everybody at a certain level, and that's a good thing. So otherwise, Jen, I didn't see anything in there. As you said, I think we're going to see some more that comes through the school aid budget, and maybe even later in the year. So I think that's good for now.
I do think we could see another supplemental later in the year. We were going to touch on that a little bit. As Bob mentioned, there is still some federal money laying on the table. There is also some state money that has been left on the table. And as we talk about the school aid budget, know that this is the only budget that is done. The legislature has not passed any of the departmental budgets. So those still remain to be negotiated and taken care of through the summer. They have that September 30th deadline. The new fiscal year starts October 1. This includes the MDE budget. So there are things within the MDE budget that we've been working on that we have to wait till they come back. They're expected to come back for a day or two in the middle of July, a week in August, and back in September. But all of these negotiations are supposed to be happening behind the scenes. So as we talk about budget, know that this is just K-12, including the fact that we don't have a community college or university budget. And as you are well aware, that money comes out of school aid. We fully expect 100% of community college funding to be school aid fund again. We don't know the amount of universities. Our hope would that it wouldn't be more than last year. But we don't have those numbers because all they did at the end of June was this budget for schools. So just to keep that in mind as we go forward, there may be questions we can't answer because MDE doesn't have a budget yet. So we're going to turn to that school aid budget. As we've said, it is before the governor. We do expect some vetoes. We just don't know what they are, and we don't expect major vetoes. It does remove all of the pandemic language that was in the budget from last year. So the school aid budget is going to look like it did at the beginning of the 1920 school year, before we knew that there was a pandemic, before we knew what we were going to face for the next 18 months. This includes the pupil count, which will go back to 90-10. If you remember last year, you had that super blend that we created to help deal with the pandemic learning, the lost students, the online learning, all the various ways schools were educating kids. This goes back to the 90-10 split. So 90 from your current year and 10 from the previous year. We're going to get into a lot of the details of the numbers. If you have questions as we go, please put them into the chat and we will answer them as we can. Hopefully we'll cover some of them as we're talking. I see that there's one about the department has to finalize how those funds will flow to schools. It is set up, it must flow through the Title 1A formula. The department cannot change that. And then the 1,093 will be determined per district basis as to how much Fed money you received and the state money you would get on top of that. So it will all flow through the department, but they can't change a lot of how that flows. So I'm going to turn it back to Bob for some number details on the budget. And as I said, just put questions in the chat as we go.
All right, thanks, Jen. And just for those that are on, it's great to see you. Unfortunately, I think we're tapped out at our 300 participants. So if you have somebody who's texting you saying, hey, I can't get in, that's fine. This is going to be recorded anyway. It is being recorded, and I'm sure that recording will be up and running shortly after we're done today. Well, as Jen said, House Bill 4411, what we are doing is previewing for you what was sent to the governor. Now, we all get a little bit cautious about this because of having veto power. And when I took a look at the final budget here that went to the governor, there are a lot of categorical items. There are a lot. There's 4 pages of appropriations on generally a page that might be 2 or 3. So when you start looking at the details, everybody and their friend here is getting some money through this budget. So what that tells me is there's probably going to be some vetoes here. Obviously, we may not know what those are yet, but there certainly are a lot of line items that have been added in, whether it was done by the House or in the late goings of the Senate before they did their revision. So just be aware what we're talking about today, and Jen already said it. The big stuff probably isn't going to change. The little stuff, which if you add them all together, they end up to be some big stuff. We may see some reallocation of some of these funds. So this is what we know today. Hold it to us until she signs it and we see what vetoes, if any, are there. And I'm sure we're going to come out, as Jen said, next week after I heard the 13th might be the day she signs off. So lots of categoricals. We saw the supplemental. That's great. Part of this, we're always this group that says, hey, this is wonderful, but is it sustainable? And I think that's what we're going to have to watch as we move forward. Certainly, we've got the federal funds that if you've listened to anything any of us have said in the past 6 months, we need to be very cautious and strategic in how districts are spending those funds. But the last thing you want to do is 3 years from now, figure out you've built up a salary structure or staffing structures that you can't handle because the federal funds are dried up. We got to be careful about that. You know what? This budget looks pretty good. There's a lot of money here, but let's take it easy. Let's just sit back, let's see what the governor comes up with, and move on from there. So let's start at the top. There's some certain things that we look at immediately. Number one, foundation allowance. So as we've heard over the last couple of months looking through the budget, substantial increase to the foundation allowance, not only the minimum, but the target now will be focused at $8,700 per district. Now, again, we saw in the House proposal that there would be a separate equity payment. The Senate has said, no, we're not doing a separate payment to get you there. We're making the minimum and target $8,700. So that is a statutory change that is different than having something out there that specifically says, here's an equity payment that gets your per pupil to a certain level. No, we are changing the minimum and target to $8,700. Those districts that were above that, there was some money added in there for not only what happens at the local level with your tax base and the state aid fund picking some of that up, but also for some of the districts that might be out of the regular calculation, there was funds added to those districts as well. So needless to say, $8,700 is the minimum, and that's what we should be expecting. Now, is that something that's going to change? My guess at this late time and what we've already seen, I doubt it. I doubt that has anything there that the governor would not suggest that she would change at this point. Another thing that's in there, we did see early on in the budget process a reduction in Cyber Schools Foundation that was not included. So 87 is your target, 87 is your foundation for the minimum, and that is a good thing. Pupil counts, Jen mentioned it. We're back to the old 90-10. So we're familiar with that. Again, is that budget stability? That is a long way to go on that. The super blend was nice, I think, because it did help us with that stability. Maybe in the future we can get to something that stabilizes a little bit better than what we've been doing on the 90-10 split. But needless to say, we are back to the 90-10. For the finance folks out there, we had a good reprieve last year with the audit and FID, which is our financial information database upload of all your financial information. Last year, those were moved to December 1st, which gave us an extra month, not only for auditing, but also for uploading all of our final numbers. That is now back to November 1, and that's consistent with the way we have seen this over the last several years now. So audit and FID due November 1st, a little bit of a change. Some language that has been added, which I think is going to help us as a school community, is the pupil accounting manual changes from time to time. Now, we see things happen generally all the time in the pupil accounting manual and the changes that come forward. There is language that states that those changes have to be in place and communicated from the department by March 31st of the year prior to those rules going in play. So that means by March 31st in our spring, we should have a good indication of what our counts look like for the next year, or I should say maybe not the counts, but the rules for the counts. If there are any changes after the fact and the legislature agrees with those, there's a period of time for districts to comply with those and not be penalized. So that's a good thing. That's something that over the years, I think we've seen late month changes, and it has impacted districts in the way that they are counting students. So that's a good thing. There is a little bit of new reporting. It's not under section 18, which is transparency reporting. However, there was a slight change there that simply said your financial audit will be posted. I think we've already known that. We've been doing that for years. They did add the word financial. Maybe that clears it up for somebody, but I think we all had it on point. But under section 19, there is a reporting update that adds the completion of early middle college credentials obtained and post-secondary credits obtained at the district level, that those also will be due to the department or I should say SEPI, similar to what you're doing with your graduation reports. What they want to do is collect more information on the number of credits that districts are providing to students through the post-secondary credit ability to obtain those. Those are due 5 weeks after pupil membership count, very similar to what we're seeing already in grad report. But for those of you that are offering those post-secondary credits or have early middle college, know that there is some reporting that's going to be needed to be done here in the coming year. Some of the things that our folks look at when they see a budget is, all right, you're telling me all good things. Everything's good so far, more money, people are smiling and happy. What didn't we see? Well, there has been some elimination of some of the categoricals that we saw come in play last year. One of those is section 11D. That was a per pupil payment that was being made to districts last year. That was about $65, $75 per pupil, came to you through 11D. That has been eliminated. So that will not be part of the 21-22 school year. That was really based on the super blend, and because we're not using that, we are not going to have that this year. Categorical offset payments, which is section 20F. Now, this is several years in the making. 18 million has been allocated over the last several years. That has been maintained. So I know that some districts who are receiving those, and that goes way back to when there were some discrepancies, and I think there was a $5 payment and a $6 payment. Needless to say, that 18 million is in the budget for 21-22, which is a good thing. It's something that our folks in the business side would look at and say, oh, well, you gave me more money here, but you took money away here. No, categorical offset payments, 20F, are funded. We saw last year 29A, increasing enrollments. Remember the number of districts that were actually losing based on the super blend count because their populations were growing. There were 66 million last year. Because of that, that has also been eliminated. So those funds for districts that were growing last year, and if the super blend actually hurt your financial, this is gone for the year. So again, knowing that increasing enrollment districts, the assumption is you're going to pick that up on your 90% count in the fall. Also, just something to mention, early on in this program, back in February, the governor came out with her plan, looked fairly decent, and there was some allocations there for declining enrollment districts. And I think people got awful excited about that. There was 200 million that the governor set aside back in February. That did not make the final legislation. So where'd that money go? Well, most likely it went into the foundation to bring those minimums up. So just, let's review this real quick. Per pupil payment of last year of $65 to $66, that's gone. Increasing enrollment, if you were one of those districts last year, that's gone. Declining enrollment, there isn't anything in this budget for declining enrollment, at least not at this point, and I doubt we're going to see anything here from the governor in the next few days. Maybe later in the year, we'll talk more about that. But for now, those are a few that have been maintained and a couple there that have been eliminated. So when you see the $8,700, that is straight up on your minimum and target foundation without some of these other things on the side. Some other things that are in the budget that survived or continued, attendance recovery. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on in the 25 section. A lot of those things are looking at summer school programs, and that's all what I'll call last year at this point, which was 2021. However, 25I, there's an increase of $4 million, which is substantial for interventions for students that have chronic absenteeism to help them actually get back on track and hopefully get them back in the classroom. There are some changes to who can participate in that. If the student was eligible or did participate in the summer program at a district, then they are eligible under the new rules. So again, 25I, chronic absenteeism and getting kids back on track, that has been funded, and a significant increase compared to the 2 million that was out there for last year. It's 6 million in this budget that went to the governor. 147, another place that we look to, and for those of you that aren't numbers people, that is retirement or MIPSR's obligation or MIPSR's buy down. Significant amount of money going into MIPSR's this year. In total, about $1.8 billion going into the retirement system through state aid. 140 million of that is going to be an increase in what we call 147C, and that is an area that is helping buy down any type of rate impact and also helping with the UAL. Now, here's the deal. The reason why the money came in this year, we have talked in the last several years about changing the assumptions of the retirement system. The retirement system works fairly simply. There are investments that create earnings, and actuarially, they look at the number of people who are drawing. They look at the return on those investments as an assumption. They also look at payrolls and whether they grow or in some cases don't grow. The assumption of the payroll growth has somewhat been out of whack over the last several years, just due to the fact that we're finding less employees. We're not seeing the pay increases, and in some cases, it's just stalled out. Well, the assumption right now is that we will increase salaries on an annual basis by 3.5%. We have missed that by a long way over the last several years. Over the tradition of the retirement system, that's a different story, but we're looking more in the short term here. That assumption is being lowered to 2.25% in this budget. So as a result of the change or what that is going to do to a rate, that is what is going to change from what I'll call above the line, so to speak. That will not be borne by the district per se. There will be more funds put in 147C to buy that rate down to our statutory 20.96. So needless to say, it's more funds that come out of school aid to buy down the retirement system, if you will. However, it's not necessarily coming out of your foundation. It is simply coming off the top of school aid, and they're using more funding to do that. Certainly an argument can be made, well, if those funds weren't used there, they could have been somewhere else. Yes, I understand that. But needless to say, the assumptions here are going to be lowered, which in the long term is, the plan of the system. And I'm not sure what the date is anymore that we would be at a very stably funded system. And that's in the coming years, where hopefully that rate will see drop after we get through some of these longer years. At risk is another area that we always look at. Not a huge change, but an additional 2.5 million in at risk. There's also some loosening up of how to spend those funds. Part of that can be used now for security, for coaching models or MTSS, professional development, and there was talk about having caps on all these. There were no caps on those in the final that has gone to the governor. However, they have added pre-K to the uses of at-risk up to 10% of the district's funds. So that's a little bit different. Now, I've seen some of the district by district impact. We put that out on our website a couple of days ago. The House Fiscal put that together. And as a district, you're going to look at that and you're going to see some changes potentially in your at-risk allocation, some up, some down. In doing a little bit of research on that, it is a couple of different things that are coming together to make that happen or make those changes happen. One of them is declining enrollment. Other areas are certainly the impact of what we've been through in the pandemic and potential for more students to qualify. So as we move forward, I think that's going to be something that we watch and see how that calculation of at-risk impacts your district. I know I've heard from a couple of districts saying, geez, we just don't understand this. I am looking into it. I haven't gotten the final answers on it. But again, it is something that we are looking at as we speak. Many of those are up north, but they're not all up north. Another increase there of 1.4 million to bring you to 8.4 million overall. Small isolated districts are going to share in 1.6 million of that. $6 million of that for districts with 10 pupils or less per square mile. So for those districts that are in the unpopulated areas or have significantly fewer students than others, but a lot of square miles, you're going to see potentially some increases in that allocation, which I'm certain that you will all appreciate. Special ed cost reimbursement. Here's a good one. More money for special ed. This brings the total approved costs up to about 3% being reimbursed. And that was an addition of 30 million for a total now of $90 million going to that. That's a 50% increase in the allocation under 51F. So again, more money into special ed, which is always something that's needed. ISD, general operations and support, ISDs will also see an increase in the coming year. That only helps local districts. If there's more money at the ISD, hopefully that helps either provide service or offset some of the costs that you at the locals are feeling. So an increased ISD is always something that is positive. Another area we've seen in the last couple of years that maintains its funding, early literacy coaches, and that's under 35A3, maintains the $31.5 million that has been in the budget. And that is to assist teachers in the development of strategies for pre through K, aiding them in attaining grade level reading. So again, another good thing continues. We're glad to see that. Additional instructional time, something we've also seen, maintains almost $20 million for those identified students that need added supports to get to that third grade reading level. So again, maintain funding. Here's an interesting one that has popped up in we've heard a little bit about it over time. However, there is $1.5 million that's being set aside in this budget for a vendor that will be selected by MDE to develop recommendations for reporting levels of non-instructional staff in IT design and system design within our school districts. So really interesting to see this. Obviously, there have been some organizations that have done some brainstorming on this. And is there a better way to operate on the non-instructional side that may produce better outcomes or be more efficient? We're going to talk IT, which are our computer systems, whether that's on the educational side or the financial side. And this is always a debate whether or not we are streamlined enough in our non-instructional areas. So $1.5 million has been allocated to select a vendor to take a closer look and provide some recommendations for the legislature to consider. MDE will be involved with that process. And I have a feeling for folks like me in our organization, this will be something that we will want to get involved with very deeply and keep our eye on and really provide information that will be helpful to determine what might be some recommendations, if any, that come out of something like this. So again, just something to keep our eye on. That's in section 94 of the school aid bill. CT equipment upgrades. This is a program we saw a few years ago back in 2018-19. It was an application process through the department. There were dollars that were set aside so that districts that 50% of their catchment area under their CPID, as it's called, if 50% or more of the districts under that CPID did not have a vocational education millage, then they would be eligible to gain some of these funds for equipment upgrades and CTE programming. I think it was about $7.5 million, something we saw back in 18-19. It was successful. Again, we see it coming out in the budget that was given to the governor. CT incentive payments, another thing that our folks look at and say, okay, what about these payments we've received the last couple of years for providing access to CTE programs for our students? I'm happy to report that that $5 million continues to be in the budget. So if you're a district that has been pushing the CTE programming, in enrolling more students over the last several years, you again will have the ability to gain a little bit of extra per pupil funding for those students, as that has been continued at $5 million. Teacher incentive or retention payments. Now, this is something we saw this year. $5 million was put out, and this was for the student, or I'm sorry, for the teacher that came in and spent the whole year in your district. And we were going to give them a bonus of $1,000 or whatever that dollar amount was. That has been eliminated. So that does not move forward past the past year of 2021. Teacher retention payments, 99Z, have been eliminated. Another real good one, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen here. One that I noticed, I looked at up front and I said, well, what the heck are we doing here? YMCA Youth and Government. Now, this is kind of interesting. As I said early on, everybody and their neighbor here seems to have an allocation in this budget. Well, here's one for YMCA Youth and Government. $3.75 million in competitive grants to districts, ISDs, or non-public schools to provide students in grades 6 through 12 with hands-on civic and model government programs. So is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, I don't know. I mean, I remember when Jen was growing up, she used to watch cartoons on Saturday, and the old Schoolhouse Rock would talk about how a bill becomes law. And really, that's what got Jen and a lot of these other lobbyists into it. They really like that cartoon. But needless to say, it is something that probably is a good thing if it's done the right way. And certainly what this is trying to do is bring students together from across the state and teach them a little bit more about how our government runs, and certainly how that always seems to be a needed area. And as a board member, I am certain when you tell somebody that you are a school board member, they really aren't sure what it is that you do. They aren't sure about what the laws are. They don't understand always how the bills that are out there become law. And you know what? This might be something that is easily supported. So, Jen, I'm going to turn it back to you. I know there's a couple here that you wanted to talk about, and maybe even some vetoes coming, but we don't know yet. But maybe next week we'll know.
Right. So we'll cover a few more sections, and then I know there's a lot of questions in the chat we'll try to get through. One thing I wanted to go back to at-risk quickly. There wasn't much of an increase in that. And the reasoning that we were told is because so much of the money, the federal stimulus money this year flowed through the Title I-A formula, that they thought that that would help take care of any at-risk increase. So there's no increase in the state at-risk money this year because the money was flowing through that Title I-A formula for ESSERs, for ESSER 2 and 3. So that would be why you see that a little bit lower than you would expect. There is money that was added for year-round school. There were two different sections. One that for anyone who is going to operate a year-round or balanced calendar for 21-22. So this would have to be something you've already planned. There is a $60 million per pupil payment to those districts who are going to do that in this coming year. And it would equal 3% of the district foundation allowance per pupil for those districts that are operating balanced calendars. And then the second part is infrastructure capital improvement grants. This is supposed to be used for HVAC, air conditioning, things like that you need to go year round. This is a one-time grant using American Rescue Plan money at $75 million, that if you commit to operating a year-round balanced calendar for the 22-23 school year, And I believe for a few years beyond that, you have to commit to, you can qualify for one of these grants for capital infrastructure improvements to your district. And that grant would be up to $1,000. No, sorry, that's the wrong one. It's the wrong one. That grant is per district. One of the things that was in here, it's a large amount of money to a vendor, is $155 million going to Grand Valley State University for a reading scholarship program. This is the one thing we formally requested to be vetoed. We've had conversations about some of the other vendor money that's in the budget, but this was one that MASB and MASA sent a formal letter to the governor asking her to veto this money. It goes to a program that is run by GVSU, so the money goes to the university. It creates a scholarship for certain eligible students in order to receive reading materials. And it's a lot of money to one vendor for a program that is unproven. So our request was that $155 million in federal money could be better spent either in our early literacy programs we already have, in some of our screening programs, in summer school, but giving districts the resources to do this versus giving it to a university to then dole out to parents almost on a voucher-like basis. And we never like anything that smells like a voucher. So that is one thing that we officially have requested, and we're hopeful that she will veto that amount. And that is, as I said, that is federal money that is going to GVSU. Then one of the programs we had talked to the governor about when she said, we're getting all of this federal money, tell me what you think you could use in sustainable, ongoing projects. And so again, MASB and MASA put together two different suggestions. One was on infrastructure, to create a capital outlay type program for schools, to create grants for infrastructure for schools, because we know that that is one of the biggest places of inequality in our districts. Unfortunately, we haven't seen anything on that yet, but there is conversation at the federal level on school infrastructure. And so we'll have to just keep our eye on those conversations. But the other one that we talked to them about was a grant program for mental health professionals in schools. And that is included in here for $240 million, which is not as much as we would have liked, but it's a start. And what it would do is allow districts with the greatest needs. So they're going to look at ratios for school psychologists, counselors, social workers, and nurses. And districts with the worst ratios would be able to apply for this grant. You'd be able to hire staff with this money. The state would pay for the staff position 100% in the first year, 66% the second year, 33% the third year, and by the fourth year, the district would be paying the full freight for that staff. The idea behind this was to create a program that was not state dependent, but gave districts the ability to build that staff person into their budgeting, into their operating budget. So we're excited to see this added. We're hopeful that it is successful. And that is, as I said, is $240 million per district for social workers, psychologists, nurses, and counselors. GSRP saw an incredible increase this year. That got moved up to $8,700 to match the foundation allowance, which is something we have been lobbying for the last few years. So your full day slot will be paid at $8,700. And then the half day, obviously half of that. This is the first major increase GSRP has seen in many, many, many years. So we're excited to see that added to the budget. There's also $17 million added into 31N, which many of you know what that is, but that is the other line item for school mental health supports that helps with Medicaid drawdown dollars. So that will increase the per ISD payment to $575,000 instead of the $460,000 that you receive now. And so that will help spread that money across the state. Then there's a school safety grant that was added by the House. And this is $10 million for competitive grants for things to do to make your school environment safer. And so this is up to $50,000 per school or $250,000 per district. And it does include non-public schools as well. We also saw a nod to transportation costs, and it's not a huge nod, but it's a step in the right direction. It includes $1 million for transportation costs on a per pupil basis for districts between 7,800 and 20,000 students, as long as you don't already receive funding through 22D, the isolated and rural districts. So this would be on a per pupil basis, and your district would have to have more than 98 square miles. It is only $1 million, but there were a lot of conversations about this year. So that is something that we can try to build on for next year. And the last section, second to last section I want to touch on is English language learners. There is a $12 million increase in the English language learners line item, which includes an increase in each of the tiers. For each tier sees a decent increase per pupil under that money. And finally, unfortunately, 152B is back. Again, I think this is going to fall to the veto pen, but this is reimbursements to non-public schools for mandated reporting and state mandates that they have to do. This, as you probably remember, has been in the courts for years, I think 3 or 4 years at this point. The legislature has continued to put this money in as we have fought the court case. We lost the last case, but it is under review. So nothing is settled yet. And we're sort of deciding what to do at this point. It was ruled that the money was allowed. We had argued it is not allowable under our Constitution. And so there's a lot more nitty gritty inside baseball legalese on that. But the main point is they've added another $1 million to that bucket. That bucket sits there until it is finally cleared of the courts and can be expended either to the private schools or back into the school aid fund. But at this point, it does look like that's going to flow out to the private schools once all court cases have been expended. So those are the last few topics we wanted to talk about. I know that there's a lot of questions in the chat. So maybe if we just want to start from the beginning. There's one question here. It's more of a political question. Who decided to use Title 1A as the basis because it largely excludes ISDs? That was a decision made at the federal level. It is one that we actually argued against after ESSER 2 to get it changed in ESSER 3 because the disparity, and it's not just our state, it's in a lot of states, the disparity under Title 1A, we have districts getting nothing and we have districts getting more than 10,000 per pupil. So we had argued to only do a portion of the federal funding through Title 1A and do the rest on a per pupil basis. But that never gained traction at the federal level. As we worked with our federal lobbyists, the answer was, this is easy and Congress likes easy. So they just stuck with the same formula. So we know that it is not necessarily a fair formula. We know people got left out of it, but we could not get the feds to budge on that. If using 90-10, how is the 10 from last spring being calculated with virtual students? No, Bob, if you have some insight into that.
Yeah, that's explained in the language of the bill itself. And actually, it's coming up with whatever your student count, audited student count from last February was, that's what they're using for the 10. So if they're included in that count, well, then certainly that's what they're using. But there is language within that area of the budget, and I think it's section 6, that explains how they are calculating using the spring count. But if they're in that spring count, that's what they're going back to. So that would be my answer. They're in there.
And then the big question, and I think we'll both take an answer to this, is the $8,700 per pupil sustainable? The way they have it written, it is the new target foundation allowance. So if it is not sustainable, that means they would have to cut the per pupil foundation allowance. I do think they're looking forward at growth in the school aid fund as to being able to sustain that. A lot of that remains to be seen. But the hope is the way they have it written, and it's been written 2 different ways to be clear. One of the versions was an increase in your per pupil through a 2X formula and then a supplemental payment. And that would have been easy to take the supplemental payment away. But the way that it passed, it is per pupil. It is your target and minimum foundation allowance, which makes it much, much harder to cut. You know, Bob, if you have some thoughts on that as well.
Well, certainly. I mean, we have a $17.1 billion budget. If there's cuts that need to be made somewhere in the future, there's a variety of areas that you can go through to make those cuts. leaving the $8,700 alone. So, you know, when you look at the totality of budget, is any of it sustainable? Well, time will tell. Obviously, there's a lot of federal money that's gone into this. And as that peels off over the next 3 years, we're going to find out whether this is sustainable or not. But given the fact that state funds are truly the funding source of the foundation, there may be other areas of the budget that we would see eliminated or reduced before we get to the foundation allowance. That would be my guess, especially due to the fact that it has now been changed statutorily and there isn't a hanging equity payment out in a categorical somewhere that's much easier to cut. This is now part of the discretionary payment, which is more difficult to make changes to. So I think the 8,700 looks pretty strong. It's the other areas that if we needed to do that in the coming years, you know, there's obviously a lot of money around the rest of the budget.
So our declining enrollment allocation is the same as isolated districts. And I want to make 2 points with this. One, declining enrollment has been removed from the budget. So we had that last year. We do not have that this year. We have had conversations with Senator Schmidt about this, who didn't totally close the door, but said that we would look at it later. So with some of the money that's left on the table, maybe we can get him back on the declining enrollment idea. And that would be if your pupil count for this year is less than last year, or possibly a 3-year average. That's how they would figure out declining enrollment allocations. Isolated districts, that is its own line item. Those are isolated and rural, so they are based on your geography, depending on how many pupils per geographic area, or there are very specific isolated districts that you can't access. They're on an island you can't access by a bridge. They are so many miles from the next district, and most of those are in the UP. So it is 2 separate things, and declining enrollment would apply to any district that has lost students, whereas the isolated is by definition. And Bob, are there any big changes regarding funding for ORS, specifically forward funding, that you see coming down the pipe?
Well, I think part of what they just did, reducing the payroll assumption, is a big thing. And that's certainly in an attempt to cut the years that we'll be buying down the UAL and becoming more well-funded. So what's a big thing? Well, once you do it, you're going to maintain doing that for the years to come. And certainly I think that this is a step in that direction, what we're seeing this year. So are there other steps coming down the pipe in a year or two? I think time will tell if they look at the assumptions and their assumptions are not coming to the levels they expect. But truly, the idea is to get the assumption down to 0. So, you know, we've got some ways to go on that. I think it's just a matter of the number or amount of funds that we have. And I feel like there are some legislators that say, if we don't do it now, when we have the additional funding, so to speak, when are we going to do it? So I guess time will tell. I saw that in the chat, but I don't really have any great answers other than saying, I think this step is the step that is starting down that path to getting things, the assumption, to 0, as well as getting it to a funded level where our rates can be impacted going down for UAL.
Moving to special ed funding, the last stimulus had IDEA funds. Those are federal dollars. So the increase that is to special ed in this budget is state dollars. And with maintenance of effort, once we go up, we can't go down. So those are not federal dollars. If we receive more IDEA funding from the feds, that would be great. That is something that we have lobbied on heavily with the feds, that they're supposed to be paying 40% of our IDEA or our special education costs, and they are at 14.8 for Michigan. So this is an ongoing fight we've been having for years, but it is separate from the money you receive from the state. So we do have that slight increase from the state that will have to be maintained through the years. And hopefully we will see more IDEA funding from the feds. And then there's a question about including students with a 504 plan. Are those included within the special ed funding increases, Bob?
I'd have to look deeper into that to know that. I'm not sure. From what I've read, I can't tell. But I did see that question. We'll have to look into that a little bit more.
There's a question about ISDs qualifying for the HVAC money to support year-round school. I don't know the answer to that. I think we need to see more out of MDE, how those grants are going to work. So I would certainly keep your eye on it, because if it's just says year-round school or a balanced calendar, I think you can make the argument, yes, but we're going to have to wait and see what the grant application looks like when it comes out of MDE. And I don't know how quickly they will get that done. The GSRP increase, is it sustainable? Let's hope so. But again, it's one of those questions. Our numbers look great today. What do they look like in 3-4 years? I don't know. So the goal obviously would be to keep it there. I think it may be sustainable, but you may not see another increase for a while, I think is what GSRP will face, similar to what they faced in the past. They get an increase and then they're stagnant. So now we've got this increase. I wouldn't be surprised if it's stagnant for a little while. The goal actually was to tie GSRP to the per pupil, so it would automatically increase when the per pupil did. They didn't do it that way. They did it with numbers, so they can keep it at 8,700 even if the per pupil continues to climb. And it is not a slot expansion. From my understanding, it is purely a per slot amount that we're getting. Let's see. How does the target foundation of $8,700 impact the hold harmless districts? Bob, you want to take that one?
Sorry, I was reading my chat there and couldn't find the screen again. There were additional dollars that were put in to offer. I believe the hold harmless districts are also included in an increase, and 40 million was put in for hold harmless districts, and it was more or less based on the calculation, state share calculation, so that it's consistent with non-hold harmless schools. So there was additional monies that were put into those districts, or I should say the budget for the calculation of that state share versus local. So again, without knowing a little bit more about it, we can certainly look into that. There is a district by district impact that may show the impact on those districts as well.
And any news on the summer school funds and when we can expect them to be allocated? I believe it was supposed to be June 15th and it got delayed. I don't know, Bob, if you've heard anything more specific than that.
I got to quit going to that chat. Yes, I believe the goal now is July 15th. So that's 7 days away. Now, I have not talked to Kevin Walters in the last few days, so I don't know how the progress, how the progress of his group has been with those funds. So I'd have to check with him. But last I heard, I believe it was July 15th. They moved it out a month.
I'm not sure the answer to this one. I'm looking up an answer to the previous one, but being told that we cannot deny a student from online learning, even if they failed courses. This is a change from other online and dual enrollment in the past. I don't remember that being changed in the final version, but I probably have to look closer. Bob, do you have a better idea?
No, I don't on that one, Jen.
Yeah, I'll have to do some digging and get back to you on that one. And I'm looking at the 31N language. There was talk of, yes, okay, so the 31N money is divided into two pots. The first pot goes out to the ISDs on that $575,000. Every ISD gets that. And then there is 5.6 million from that line item that will be distributed on an equal per pupil basis to ISDs. So you'll get money from 31N through two different ways. One is just the flat amount everybody gets, and then there is an additional per pupil amount that will flow to the ISDs as well. And this was a conversation that had been going on, and it was on and it was off again and on again and off again, but it is included in the language under 31N for this year. The 1093 money is governed by the same pandemic ESSER spending categories. I think those are free and clear. I need to double check that I'm right, but I don't think they put additional money on that. If you'll give me a second, I'll come back to that question.
Yeah, I think if you look in the language of the bill, and for some reason 5N is coming into my mind on that. I don't know why, but I think within the section that it did say that those funds would have to follow. I see Paul says 11T.
11T, yep, I'm getting there.
I thought that they did have to follow the same restrictions as the 15, but it'll be a good one to look up.
Yeah, they'll have to follow the same restrictions that the Title 1A money receives. And you will have to submit a spending plan within 45 days of when the budget is signed. But it doesn't include, like you saw in the first set of equalization payments, it doesn't include that face-to-face, you must be face-to-face so many hours and things like that. It does talk about what you can use the money on. 51.4% on learning loss, 10.3% on summer enrichment, 10.3% on after-school programs, which is similar to what the feds put on the Title 1A money as well.
Paul's got a comment there.
I don't believe that's true. The normal ESSER 3 does not have the same restrictions as the 10% portion of ESSER 3. The 10% portion of ESSER 3 has these additional percentage requirements. The original ESSER 3 does, or the formula ESSER 3 does not.
The 10% is broken down in addition to the rest of it. That's correct.
Right, but there are restrictions under Title 1A, that funding, there are restrictions as to what it can be used for, or what it is supposed, the amounts that are supposed to be used for. So if these numbers are different, they're following the same idea, and I just don't have the Fed language in front of me to tell you exactly what's different. But the idea was for them to follow the language that was already being imposed on those that are receiving Title 1A. What the state didn't do was add the face-to-face learning, the number of hours you had to be in school, all of those things that they did with the 450 that we got earlier in the year. Are there any other questions? We're coming up on our 1 o'clock and we want to be respectful of your lunch hour. But are there any other questions that we didn't cover or anything we missed in the chat as we scrolled through it?
John, there's one on flexibility language did not make it. Is there any flexibility language for elementary remote learners?
There is not, and this is a conversation we have been having with MDE for months. MDE has the ability to grant seat time waivers, and we are pushing them to use that flexibility for districts. MDE has pushed back that they need that they want the legislature to say it, but the language is there for MDE to do it. So right now we're in a push-pull with them trying to get some more flexibility. We know there are students that are not going to want to come back face-to-face in the fall. They might not be comfortable yet. They may have flourished on online learning. So we are still working on that and hopeful we can get something. But at this point, no, there's nothing in the budget. All the flexibility that was there during pandemic learning, you can't use that language. There is, you're back to the language you had before for flexibility and for seat time for both pupil accounting manual and for the school aid budget. The transportation I mentioned, it's a $1 million for transportation costs to districts with more than 7,800 and less than 20,000 students and at least 98 square miles. It does seem pretty specific, but at least it's a step in the right direction, and it would be distributed on a per pupil basis to those eligible districts as long as they are not receiving isolated and small district money out of 22D. The Inkster categorical, I'm glad you called it that because I had to dig to find out what that money was for. There is a payment in the budget to pay off the debt of a district that no longer exists. And it took a while to get an answer as to where exactly they were putting that money. It is to Inkster. It is to finish paying off the Inkster debt because Inkster no longer exists.
And I think, Jen, again, it's probably a good thing to say. Next week, we're going to see what the final is. So there are some major dollars that we've talked about today that may or may not make that last cut of the governor's pen. The grand value at 155 million, that's significant money. Some of these others that we've talked about may not be as much as we're thinking, but in total, they might be. I mean, we just named a couple of them there. So again, I think next week we're really going to be able to hone in and see what these funds are going to be used for. If there are vetoes, maybe they're not allocated, maybe they are. But things will change a little bit next week.
And that'll certainly lead us into the summer as money is still on the balance sheet as to where that money goes. So as usual, conversations never end. So if you have questions for us, please let Bob or I know. If you run into issues as you start implementing some of the things in the budget that are questions or concerns, let us know that too. This is our chance. If they have to reopen the school aid budget because of vetoes and they want to allocate the money, this is our chance to get things changed. So always let us know if there are issues or things that need to change. We are always in conversation with the legislature, except for a couple of days that we go on vacation. But anything we can do to help as we go forward, let us know. We will make this recording available, hopefully by early next week, and keep your eye out for an update next week. I do see one final question that was just sent to me, allowing schools to be reimbursed for school of choice students. Yes, that was changed. That was fixed in 4421, the supplemental that went through. So you can count your school of choice students. The problem was timing, so hopefully you were able to do that and we'll get reimbursed from MDE. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Bob, for all of your information and all the numbers.
Thank you, Jen.
Words person than a number person, so we always appreciate having you here. And as always, let us know if we can help. Have a great day.
Thank you.